Welcome, everyone. I am Angelica Diggs, the Executive Director of the Montclair History Center. Thank you for joining tonight's History at Home presentation on the history and anniversary of the Montclair Ambulance Unit. Founded in 1953, MAU has provided 70 years of emergency medical services to the people of Montclair. What began as an all-volunteer initiative is now staffed by 45 paid professionals, operates 4 ambulances, and its crews are on duty around the clock at their current home in the historic former Walnut Street Firehouse. Tonight, we are joined by Chief Mazza on behalf of MAU, and we'll be sharing more about MAU's mission and service, as well as by Kristen Ryan, Director of Development and Public Information Officer for MAU. Last fall, the Montclair History Center and MAU partnered to digitize MAU's collection and make it available online. Montclair History Center collections intern Moira Armstrong, also here with us tonight, worked under the supervision of our collections manager, Erin Ben, to digitize and catalog this collection, now available through the History Center's website. Moira has an extensive background in collections management, preservation, and digitization. Moira is currently pursuing a PhD in American Studies at Rutgers University, and with the goal of working in the public history academia field. Moira has recently worked on collections management projects with institutions such as the Museum of Transology, Library of Congress, and the Queer Pandemic Oral History Project. Moira will be sharing some of the discoveries found in the collection tonight, documenting the milestones of MAU's history throughout time. Before I pass off the presentation to our presenters, just want to make a note that this program is made possible by funding through a grant from the New Jersey Council for Humanities, a state partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Hello, my name is Moira Armstrong. I'm a PhD student in American Studies at Rutgers University, and I was an intern in the fall with the Montclair History Center under Erin Benz, and I worked on digitizing the Montclair Ambulance Unit archive. So I'm just going to briefly go through some of the milestones that emerged from the collection, and then I'll throw it over to the chief to talk about what the unit is like today. So the unit was first founded in 1953, so they're in their 71st year. Originally, it was known as the Montclair Volunteer Ambulance Unit because all of the people who responded to calls and worked on the administrative end were volunteers. As you'll see in later slides, that eventually changed. That is part of what played a role in the sort of homogenous first iteration of the unit that you see here. Everyone in this first unit photo is a white man. And, that comes in part from who had the time and availability and also the sort of financial status to volunteer such a large commitment at the time. But of course, that again changes, and we'll see that over the course of the next couple of slides. The unit was pretty busy from the start. In September of 1953, they responded to their 60th call, transporting a woman who had had a heart attack from Bloomfield Avenue to Mountainside Hospital. This photo was reprinted in the Montclair Times. It, like a lot of the other early photos, were taken by a local photographer named John Maxon. Maxon had a studio on Bloomfield Avenue. There are some ads for that studio in the Montclair Times that say he did portraits, wedding photography, things like that. And he had a pretty close involvement with the early unit. And so that's where a lot of these early pictures come from. And that's really nice to have because, it's not always guaranteed. The farther you go back in history, sort of less likely there is to be a lot of record. So in November of 1953, the Montclair Red Cross started to lend their building for the Board of Trustees and the unit volunteers to meet there. They were using it as their headquarters at first because they didn't have a building of their own yet. This photo is actually from 1941, so more than 10 years before the start of the unit itself. But it shows Theodore McLaughlin, who later became the first captain of the ambulance unit. He's giving a first aid class at the Red Cross, showing artificial respiration. So it shows that, there was a pretty close relationship between people who eventually had large roles in the ambulance unit and the Red Cross, which may have played a role in why the Red Cross ended up lending their building to the unit. In November of 1953, the unit started to assist the town with civil defense efforts. Civil defense was the government's response to the threat of nuclear attacks from the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and Montclair had a couple of drills throughout the 1950s that pulled together local government employees, the police department, the fire department, and once they were formed, the ambulance unit, basically to practice how the town would respond to a nuclear attack. These are photos from the Montclair Times of that drill. They're a little bit dark, but you can see on the left part of what the worry was about civil defense was that after a nuclear attack, it was thought that the country might devolve into sort of chaos with looting and rioting and things like that. So you can see they've had some people pretend to be looters and they're practicing responding to that. And the ambulance unit at the time was practicing responding to the sort of injuries that could result from a nuclear attack. This is one of a couple instances we see in the archive of the unit sort of helping out the town with something, even though from the beginning they weren't part of the town and still aren't. In April of 1954, the unit voted to accept women as members for the first time, on day crews at first. This is an excerpt from the meeting minutes of the ambulance unit trustee meeting where they made this decision. And it says, Charles Surrey introduced the necessity of having women become members to aid the day crew men. After a discussion, it was approved that women be accepted as members. Staffing and the sometimes lack of having enough people was an ongoing problem. It comes up a lot in meeting minutes saying, we need to bring in more people. And, the first time that they start talking about bringing in women is framed in that way of we don't have enough men to staff these crews. So it's a far cry from the diversity of the unit today. They're about 50% female now. But it's definitely a start back in the 1950s. So in summer 1954, we see the unit holds its first fundraising drive. So because the unit's never been part of the township or received township funds or tax funds, fundraising has been a really important part of the unit's operations since the beginning. Fundraising documents are like the most reliable thing in this archive. We have them from the majority of the unit's history. This is the first ever fund drive mailer, and it included a letter from the president of the board of trustees explaining why the unit was important, a page of highlights from their second year of operations, talking about how much calls had risen. They mentioned that calls in the second year were 66.7% more than the calls in the first year, so they're growing exponentially. And it also included on the far right there a small envelope that recipients could send back with a donation. Like I said, went out in the summer of 1954. In January of 1956, the unit acquired their first ever independent building. It was located at 69 Portland Street, and this image shows the owner signing the deed over to the unit. It's surrounded by members of the board, and I believe Theodore McLaughlin is in this photo as well. He comes up quite a bit in the early years of the archives. The unit moved into that building in May of 1956, and this photo shows a few of the volunteers in the middle of the moving process, with what I think is the earliest ambulance that the unit ever had. And it looks very different from the ambulances today, and even some of the later ambulances that will show up in photos here. Then in the fall of 1954, workers at Mountainside Hospital went on strike, and the unit helped out when they were needed at the hospital when there weren't enough personnel to take care of patients. This photo is actually not dated. It's unclear if it's from the strike period or not. I decided to include it here because it shows the ambulance dropping off a patient at Mountainside Hospital. The two men in uniform there are from the ambulance unit, and the woman is identified as a Mountainside nurse. There are a couple photos in the archive like this, showing the unit members working together with Mountainside staff to take care of patients. In November of 1963, the trustees introduced the possibility of integrating the unit. Similarly to when women were included for the first time, it was framed as because they needed more staff. It's actually not totally clear when integration was actually adopted. This is a photo of the unit from 1970. It's the first one in the archive that shows members of color, but there aren't unit photos for most of the 60s, so it's not entirely clear when the first members of color joined, but it was introduced for the first time in 1963. Again, small step towards the diversity of today. 35% of the members today are people of color. In September of 1967, women were allowed to ride on night crews for the first time. This is an image from pretty significantly later. This is from 1978, but it shows a night crew that's 45% women and 20% people of color, which again shows just some more incremental growth toward the diversity of the unit today. This, I think, is a really fascinating artifact as, someone who studies history. So in May of 1968, protests about the Vietnam War and the assassination of Martin Luther King were sweeping across the country. And the chief of the Montclair Police Department spoke at an ambulance unit trustee meeting. This is an excerpt from the meeting minutes from that meeting. He talked about the quote unquote civil disturbances happening around the country, assigned an officer to protect the unit personnel, advised that ambulances not use their lights or sirens, advised that at least one person always stay with the ambulance, and said that if there were going to be protests in Montclair, the ambulance should stay out of the area unless they were needed, to keep the phone lines clear and to not carry firearms. Looking back, it doesn't show a great understanding of what was happening at the time. The meeting minutes say that, quote, riots had usually been triggered by law enforcement personnel doing their duty. And looking back, we know that people were responding to mass death in Vietnam and systemic racism in the United States. But this is pretty typical of the way that these protests were being talked about at the time. So I think it's a really fascinating historical artifact. In 1970, the unit purchased a new building at 86 Valley Road for their headquarters. This image shows the building in 1975 when it was under construction. You can also see one of the newer ambulances on the left of the photo, which is also really interesting to just watch the ambulance technology change really significantly over time. In May of 1973, so at this time, oil-producing countries in the Middle East were refusing to sell oil to the United States. And as a result, there were really significantly higher taxes and significant limits on gas purchases around the country, including in Montclair. This is an article from the Montclair Times, showing how frustrating it was for people in Montclair. The headline says, "Fill her up, a vanishing cry." And the article says, "A month ago, you could drive into a gas station here and say, 'Fill her up.' A few weeks ago, you may have been told, 'I'm sorry, all I can give you is 10 gallons. Yesterday, it may have been down to $3 worth is all you can have. Tomorrow, who knows?" Yes, Virginia, there is a gasoline shortage, and by the looks of it and the word going around, it may be with us for quite a while. The article goes on to quote several Montclair residents and gas station owners who were really annoyed and angry at the situation. And even though, again, unit was still not really part of the township, was not like part of a government structure, but they were still sort of recognized as being important enough to exempt from the taxes and limits imposed on gas usage at the time, which typically was only available to things like police and fire departments that were part of a municipal structure. So I think that's a really interesting sort of tension there, because that was not common for anything that was outside of a government structure. In October of 1978, we see the first mention in the archives of the lack of funding from the township as a problem. So this is, again, an excerpt from Board of Trustee meeting minutes. These are, again, a sort of really consistent type of document in these archives. One member brings up that the unit was, quote, one of the few or possibly only units not receiving town aid, and the board should give some consideration to either receiving town aid or charging people. And as we'll see in future slides, the unit has never been able to become part of the town or receive town aid, but did start to receive some revenue from other sources as time went on. One of those other sources was the Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. The Medicare and Medicaid Act, which is what's pictured here, was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 and established Medicare and Medicaid for low-income and senior Americans. And in October of 1978, the unit began to receive reimbursement from these programs for some costs associated with responding to calls from people who were enrolled in these programs. And this is something that I'm sure the chief will talk about more later. But today, about 75% of the unit's funding comes from insurance billing, like the Medicare and Medicaid billing. And that money goes toward paying the staff, while 25% comes from grants and fundraising and individual contributions. In October of 1980, the unit did their first big overhaul of their bylaws. They had still, previous to this, been operating on the bylaws that were written sort of on the fly in 1953 when the unit realized that they needed bylaws. Um, there's some interesting correspondence with the lawyer for the unit at the time who points out that the bylaws seem like they were written in a rush. There are some contradictory parts, there are some parts that don't make sense. But another big part of the rewrite, other than sort of fixing the issues that they had found when they consulted a lawyer, was trying to reflect the way that the unit had changed over time in terms of who was participating. So, for example, the old bylaws exclusively used he and him pronouns to refer to unit personnel and sometimes explicitly said, like, members are men. But the updated version goes back and forth, uses he, him in some places, she, her in others, sometimes both, and switches out a lot of language for more gender neutral terms. Like at the beginning of this section, we see a person shall XYZ instead of a man. And again, this just indicates, the unit is growing, the unit is becoming more diverse, and they're making changes to change with the people who belong there. So this is from 1981. This is the first paid job description that's listed in the archives. It was for an executive director. That role included maintaining the building, the grounds, the rig, and the radios, doing office work, and overseeing the daytime riding members. Previous to this, the members had mostly been volunteer, and today the unit is entirely paid. And this is a change that we can sort of start to see in the archive over time. There are more and more of these official job listings and less calls for volunteers. In January of 1982, the first ever female captain of the unit was appointed. Her name was Carol Kobach. She joined the unit originally in 1975, and over the course of her membership in the unit, she held a lot of different roles. She was a public relations officer, she was a training lieutenant, she was a cardiopulmonary resuscitation instructor, and then she was eventually appointed captain, which the sort of format for becoming captain changed a bit over the years. It started as a vote by the membership. Eventually, the board was sort of brought in to consult on the captain appointing. I actually don't know how it operates today. That might be something that Kristen or the chief can speak to. But this was the first time a woman had been appointed into that role. In September of 1987, the unit explicitly addresses the AIDS crisis. At a unit meeting, again, this is a screenshot from the minutes, one member, quote, brought to our attention that the AIDS epidemic is a real thing and recommended that the unit carry and wear gloves and be aware of the bodily fluids of the patients that they were working with. This is another example of the unit responding to the threats of the time, as we saw earlier with civil defense. And it's my personal favorite thing I found as I was working on this project. My main research is about queer history, and in most examples of history from the early years of the AIDS epidemic, the discussions tend to go in a really denialist or homophobic direction. So I think it's really, really incredible that the unit acknowledged the threat, but didn't do it in a way that was sort of more marginalizing toward queer people. This is from April of 1987. The first paid ambulance crews were hired. This is a screenshot, excuse me, of the first job description. And then the next year, in February of 1988, all of the crew members had to become certified EMTs for the first time. You can see from this screenshot, there were some additional training requirements that were needed. They had to turn in some paperwork and registration with the state. But these two changes, the switch to paid crews and the switch to all certified EMTs, was a pretty big change for the unit, and the way that it was structured and the way that they brought in people to work on the ambulances. In June of 1988, the unit switched over to computers for record keeping, which maybe seems like a small thing, but you know, looking back in the archives, you see handwritten meeting minutes and agendas. You see what we have here, which are hand-drawn charts and tables documenting the unit's finances. Computers were definitely a very needed upgrade so that someone didn't have to painstakingly write all of the finances in neat columns anymore. So at this point, we start to see like typewritten documents. In a few slides, eventually the website gets established. So the switch to computers made a big difference for the unit. Skipping ahead to 1994, in 1994, the current Medicaid reimbursement rate was set. As I mentioned today, about 75% of the unit's funding comes from insurance billing, including Medicaid billing. And I'm sure this is something that the chief will talk about as well, but it's a pretty big problem that the reimbursement rate has not changed in so long, especially, as we can see in this inflation calculator, the cumulative rate of inflation since 1994 has been over 100%. That's a pretty substantial change. And considering how much the unit needs these funds, it really is a problem that it hasn't kept up with the times. This is from September of 2001. The unit assisted with the response to the 9/11 attacks in New York City and received this service commendation from the New York City Fire Department for their assistance. In June of 2003, when SARS was becoming an issue, the unit responded to that pandemic with some training. Again, another example of like health threats, public health threats, and the unit's response. Then in August of 2003, the unit began talks with the town about the 95 Walnut Street building, which Angelica mentioned earlier is the historic station house. It was built by the architect J. Warner Allen. He built a couple schools in New Jersey and also an apartment building in Long Island City. He's known for this like terracotta work that you can see over the door and in some other areas on the building. And the unit's been based here for the past 20 years. In 2004, the unit celebrated their 50th anniversary. I think this document is so interesting because it really mirrors the document we were looking at earlier, the first fund drive document that was talking about the first year of service. Again, it points out why the unit is important, and points out some of the highlights of their years of service. And it, in this, like, please help us continue the tradition, asks for the public support to continue the work that they do. And then lastly, in 2007, they started their first unit website. This is so interesting. The Internet Archive which is a really cool site if you're interested in like the history of the web. This is the earliest screenshot of the website that I could find on there. It is really, really substantially different from the very lovely unit website today. It's just like very basic, like text, this is what we do, here's our email. Um, but it's super fascinating. You can, if you're interested, you can go to the Internet Archive and sort of click through all of the times that the website has been saved and see how it evolves over time, which I think is super interesting. And that is all I have. So I will throw it over to the chief to talk about the unit today. And I still have the screen share, so just let me know when you need me to change slides.
Perfect. I first I want to thank the History Center and Moira for all the work that they've done. We've lost substantial archives over the years in various floods in our building. Our basement is unfortunately our building sits in a flood zone, so we know we've lost substantial records. So when we were able to get everything that we had together, this was a natural fit, and I just want to thank the opportunity to do this. All right, let's hit the next slide, I guess. So what does MAU do today? Montclair Ambulance Unit, we are the sole provider for 911 EMS to the Montclair Township around the clock every day of the year. We're also providing EMS to Cedar Grove from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. daily. Now, when I say we're providing EMS to Cedar Grove, what that means is we actually have a separate vehicle, a separate ambulance that is stationed in Cedar Grove with different EMTs working out of Cedar Grove. It's not coming out of Montclair. It's not taking resources from Montclair. It's an additional resource. Last year, we provided 911 mutual aid support to 24 neighboring communities. From a call volume standpoint, in 2022, we did 3,769 911 emergencies. In 2023, that number jumped to 4,736. And based on the first quarter the projections for the rest of the year, we are on track to, I don't want to say 5,500, but it's pretty close to that. We're going to just consistently continue going up. What we do not do is we do not take scheduled or non-emergency transports. So we will get a call. I want to say once every 2 weeks or so from a resident asking if we can do something like that. We simply don't have the bandwidth. We're really tied up on 911 emergencies. And by law, we can only take patients to hospital emergency rooms. We've had patients ask if they can go to an urgent care center or their doctor, and we really can only transport people to emergency rooms. Next slide. So who works at MAU today? As mentioned prior, we are 50% female, 35% people of color. Every creed, LGBTQ plus is represented. So we really are a diverse melting pot that truly represents the community that we're serving now today. How chiefs are selected. We at some point, captain evolved to the title of chief to be on par with police and fire departments. And how it's selected today is the board of trustees. They will put out a job posting and hire and keep said person until such time as they either get a new job or determine the board wants to go in a different direction. In the last 5 years or so, we've had a female chief. And when I started, the chief at the time decided to step down and is still with us as a supervisor, but he felt his role was more important as a supervisor than as chief, and here we are. But we have 45 certified emergency medical technicians on staff. All but 2 of them are paid. We have 2 that are choosing to volunteer. One of them is our board president, who's been with us for 30 years. Our leadership team is comprised of 6 EMTs and emergency managers. So among our leadership team, we have 5 bachelor's degrees, 3 master's degrees, an advanced FEMA PIO, 2 deputy OEM coordinators for the township, and I'm sure I'm missing 1 or 2 things there. we are rather diverse. The only person on staff who is not an EMT is our social media coordinator. That person is part-time and a college student. Everyone else that works for us is a certified EMT. Next slide. So we're part of the community, but we aren't a department of Montclair Township, and it's a really important distinction. We want to make sure people understand that we are as much a part of this community as the police department, the fire department, the health department, but we aren't part of the township of Montclair. So what that means is we receive no operational funding from Montclair Township or residents' taxes. They will provide, the township does provide the building that we work out of, as well as our fuel. And we're in talks to have them provide some of the different insurances we have to carry, like liability, workers' comp, and automobile insurance. And we are grateful for every bit of support the township provides. But when it comes to paying our bills or paying our staff, we don't receive any funding for that. And we've been a 501c3 since 1952. That's the founding date, but we didn't do any emergency calls until 1953. So it's a very interesting organization that has a very special role in the community, but is not part of the township. And there's an educational challenge there that we work on, and Kristen beats her head against the wall trying to work on daily. Next slide. I already jumped ahead. So what the township does pay for, though, is the lease of the building and fuel, not operations, not staffing, not ambulances or ambulance maintenance. We spend $80,000 on ambulance maintenance last year, 40,000 for one vehicle alone. That vehicle is permanently out of service this year, dropping our fleet of ambulances from 5 to 4. So we're 20% down, and we have no capital, so to speak, to purchase another ambulance right now. So we have to figure out how we're going to make that work. Next slide. It was brought up earlier that we have insurance billing. So Medicare and Medicaid and private insurance is our bread and butter of how we fund our operation. It really breaks down to the insurance billing covers 75% and fundraising 25%. That 75% pretty much covers all of our staffing. So all of the salaries, the workers' comp insurance, the health insurance that we provide our employees, all of that is covered by insurance billing. We know going out the door, it costs us roughly $350 a call to go out the door. And on average, we're going to get a return of approximately $250 to $260 back from insurance. Seems so low. The reason behind that is we serve everyone equally, regardless of their ability to pay. If they don't have insurance, we wind up not really collecting any money on that. We'll send a bill, and hopefully we're going to get some money back, but there's no guarantees. Medicaid rate was set in 1994. Kristen likes to mention, I was in second grade when that rate was set, and it has not moved since then. That means we're only getting $58 for a Medicaid patient. The last year we have complete data was 2022, and we transport 1,000 patients with Medicaid. That means on those calls, we've lost approximately $300 every call we went on for a Medicaid patient, giving us a deficit of $300,000 a year. And we're projecting similar for 2023's budget once all the numbers finalize, as well as 24. Fundraising, which is also Kristen's role. We wish we had her full time, but she is unfortunately part time because we don't have the capacity to pay her for full time. Is the 25% that gets the rest of the ambulance out the door. That's the medical supplies, the workers' comp, the different rig maintenance, the day-to-day stuff. We still have to buy toilet paper like everyone else, right? And this year we saw a sizable jump in our budget up to $2 million. Last year it was in the 1.4, 1.5 range, and the majority of that is due to our own growth. We're not just covering Cedar Grove during the day. We've added what we call power trucks, which is using an existing ambulance, taking that ambulance and adding additional crew members, so that way we can staff additional ambulance at our busy times. So over the course of a year, we slowly added that power truck in. We've seen a 20% growth in call volume year over year, and that 20% correlates to that power truck. That power truck has done 20% of the calls since its inception. Next slide. So As we said, we're very grateful for what the township does provide. Many people ask us why they don't provide more. Unfortunately, in the state of New Jersey, they legally don't have to. Municipalities don't have to fund EMS. While Montclair Township is supportive, New Jersey does not recognize EMS as an essential public service. New Jersey has stated that police has to be provided by a municipality, fire service, sanitation, animal catcher, um, health department, water department. EMS is not a requirement. Technically, in New Jersey, if somebody calls 911 in a town, they could say, "We don't have an ambulance. You need to call somebody else." I don't think it will ever happen because it'd be political suicide for whatever town decided to do that. But legally, there's no requirement for an ambulance. So they have no requirement to provide funding. So they provide what they do, and we're grateful for what they do provide. Next slide. And that really wraps it up. We invite everyone that we meet to come have a tour with in our historic 1906 station house. It is 118 years old. It has a lot of character. Character is expensive, but it grows on you. Meet our whole team, learn how we're operating. We're an open book. Ask us any questions you might ever have. My email is there and our phone number is there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Mazza, and thank you, Moira. Wonderful presentations. It's really cool. I know all of us behind the scenes have been exploring the online collection for a little while now, so it's really neat to see that timeline come to life. And I have to say, take up Chief Mazza on the tour. Me and Erin of the History Center did that. And we even got to see like firefighters' names carved into the basement staircase or things like that. It's pretty cool to check out that building and also see how a robust operation fits inside a historic building is always fascinating too. So I thank you all so much for that presentation. If you didn't catch it in the chat, I did put the link to the digital collection online. So if you really want to dive deep into some of the topics we talked about this evening, you can do that and explore the archives. But I do want to open it up. I didn't see anything in the chat, but does anyone have a question they might like to ask? Unmute, feel free. Anything about MAU or its history? I'll give it a minute. And I apologize. I goofed big time and I forgot to hit record at the beginning. So I startled you all, particularly Moira. So I'm going to nudge Moira to re-record that first part so we can make sure this can be shared with anyone who couldn't come tonight. So I apologize. That was my fault. All right. There's no questions.
Can I share one thing really fast?
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kristen. I'm the Director of Development and Public Information Officer. I'm sending you a letter like next week. Everyone gets mail from him, from the chief. Our annual spring fund drive letter comes out next week. It says in great big bold letters that we're part of the community, but your taxes don't pay your EMTs in Montclair. So if you would help us share the word about how we're funded and how we operate, and our great reverence for our history and our legacy and our part of the community, and tell your friends how we work and encourage them to come and meet us and watch for my letter in the mail. I mean, James's letter in the mail.
Your letter.
Erin had a question in the chat. Moira, you dived so deep into this collection. What were some of your favorite things you found, or anything that really stood out to you, maybe that you didn't get to share tonight that you personally enjoyed learning about?
Yeah, I really loved there are some big bound books that include a lot of different documents, lots of minutes and financial documents and that sort of thing. But in the very first one, which runs from like the origination of the unit through, I want to say like the early 60s, it includes the catalog for like the first ambulance that the unit ever purchased. It is a fascinating document. Highly recommend going and checking that out on the online archive. It's so interesting. It's a far cry from like what we think of as an ambulance today, but it's just so interesting to see.
The ambulance back then, I believe, was what, $10,000, that pamphlet.
Yep.
Today would be $350,000. That's what we're looking at to replace the current ambulance. Um, it, it's always interesting looking at history. Uh, our own profession gets our own history wrong. And I don't mean Montclair Ambulance Unit. I mean EMS as a profession. There's a really fascinating book called American Sirens about the start of what is known as paramedicine in America. Um, a lot of people in even our own profession, they think it started with California paramedics from LA County Fire. They think of the old TV show Emergency with Johnny and Roy. And in reality, it started in 1960, I believe it was 7 or 8, in a predominantly African American neighborhood in Pittsburgh. It was called Freedom House EMS. Dr. Peter Saffer, who created what we know as CPR today, he saw the care that was being provided in the streets and said there needs to be a change. In Pittsburgh specifically, the Pittsburgh Police Department was providing care, and they would take somebody, put them in the back of the ambulance, and the 2 police officers would ride up front. There was no care. It was literally just a ride to the hospital. Um, and Dr. Saffer set out to change that, and it turned out that for a number of years, when Freedom House existed, if you lived in a poorer section of Pittsburgh, you were getting better care than if you lived in a richer section of Pittsburgh, because Freedom House EMS was only allowed to serve their community, and they served it well. They, a couple of years ago, I think it was, they put on all their ambulances a decal to remember where their roots were, Pittsburgh EMS, that is. So it's a really interesting read, a really easy read.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that. Rita put in the chat, Rita, this question resonates with me as well, as, you know, individuals who are really passionate about operating nonprofits. So you said that, does MAU experience challenges retaining talent since you faced financial revenue challenges as well?
It's the whole profession has challenges retaining talent. MAU is no different than the rest of the profession, but I've said for a while now, we drive our best and brightest out of our profession because we can't afford to pay them what they deserve. So people see EMS as a stepping stone career, myself included. When I started in EMS at 19, I saw it as a stepping stone to law enforcement that turned into eventually a stepping stone to nursing, and it turned into my career. But people come into this field all the time to get experience, to go into police or fire, or become a doctor or a nurse or a physician assistant. And we get them for 1 to 5 years, and then they're gone. So the problem that we are facing, as well as every other agency, particularly in the volunteer agencies, is that middle management and succession planning. I can't do this forever. My deputy chief can't do this forever. Kristen can't do this forever. We need to plan the next set of leaders, and we're going to have a problem when that time comes because there's no next set of leaders behind us. They've all gone off to different careers in healthcare or different careers in public safety. So we really do need to create a career ladder for EMS. There are hospital-based systems as well as volunteer systems in Essex County that are struggling for members and struggling for staffing their ambulances. Knock on wood, we don't have that problem in Montclair. I like to say, if funding was no object and vehicles were no object, I probably could put an additional ambulance up tomorrow. I have 45 plus employees fighting for the same hours. They wish I had more hours to give them.
Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts, questions? Anyone's also welcome to unmute if you like. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight. Really wonderful presentations. Moira, Chief Mazza, we really appreciate it. We will have this placed up on our YouTube channel, so we'll share that with the net. So if anyone missed it, we can send that around. Don't forget to check out MAU's website, the digital collection, as well as the History Center. For anyone looking for our next History at Home, it will be next month Oh, I got to pull up that date there on my screen. It will be on May 16th with historian Lizanne Renner on the Upper Montclair Bellevue Avenue Library. So one of the Carnegie libraries in Montclair. So feel free to come and learn more about its architecture. But thank you again, Kristen, James, Moira, for all of your work and dedication to serving the community and sharing it with us tonight. We appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Oh, Mark, did you want to share about what you found? Can I put you on the spot for the last moment? I almost forgot.
You mean the plaque?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, my stepdad was involved with the Montclair Volunteer Ambulance Unit for many years, and he was friends with your first captain. And somehow he ended up with the plaque that should have been in the possession of the ambulance unit all along. But after he died, my mom found it and gave it to me, and I was fortunate enough to give it to you.
Thank you, Mark. And Mark Porter is a Board of Trustee member at the History Center. So we're hoping having this collection online spreads more awareness. And like Mark found at home in his own archives, I'm sure there's more things out there, so hopefully that gets shared for MAU to add to your own collection now as well.
We've received an additional picture that was in our Valley Road building that the current owners of the Valley Road building reached out after seeing the archive saying, I've got this picture and we really have no need for it. Do you guys want it? So we're probably going to see stuff like that trickle in.
That's great. And that's what makes us excited as history professionals. So we're thrilled. Awesome. All right. Thank you, Mark. And thank you everyone tonight. Have a great rest of this evening.